Okay, well, welcome back to the final forum, or the final panel, rather, for the forum. This panel is entitled IAIS, Charting the Future of Insurance Supervision in a Rapidly Changing World. Our moderator is David Altmaier, the NAIC's most recent past president and the commissioner from the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation. And on the panel today will be Romain Paserot, the Deputy Secretary General of the IAIS. We also have Bryan Pickel, the Head of External Affairs at Prudential Financial. And we have Siham Ramli, Director of Communications and International Relations for the Insurance and Social Welfare Supervisory Authority in Morocco. So with that, please welcome our panel, and David is our moderator.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it. Thank you, Commissioner Anderson, and thanks to each of you for serving on our panel, and good morning to all of you. It's been such a full day already that it feels weird that I'm still saying good morning, but I think we've got a little bit longer before we can switch to good afternoon. So if you've stuck it out with this long, great news. We have saved the best panel for last, so you're in for a real treat here. So these three I know are going to have some really great insights onto our topic here. I do want to say a special thanks to Romain. I think you are standing in at the very last minute. Jonathan had to unfortunately stay behind, so thank you for hanging in there. So as Commissioner Anderson mentioned, we do have a panel on charting the future of insurance supervision in a rapidly changing world, and I think we've had a really good collection of panels over the past day and a half that have covered just such a wide variety of topics. And I think the one underlying theme in all of those topics is that the challenges and risks and opportunities that are in the insurance industry are continuously evolving. And to successfully address those ongoing and emerging issues, it's really important for supervisors and consumers and our industry and all of our stakeholders to work together and to learn from one another, to share those experiences across the insurance sector. So we're going to spend the next hour kind of talking through not only the changing world, but how the IAIS as an organization is rising to the challenges of a lot of those changes. And so with that, we'll get underway. I do want to make sure that you remember that we are taking questions from you using the Slido app. Somewhere or another, there was a number that you can utilize to get to that. Hopefully, at this point, you already know how to do that, because that's the extent of my knowledge of how to explain that. But if you do have a question, feel free to stick it into the Slido app, and hopefully we'll have some opportunities at the end to get into that. So let's just get into the questions here. So over the past 10 years, as you all know, the IAIS has spent a lot of time and energy on developing policy responses to the last financial crisis. With ComFrame and the holistic framework adopted at the end of 2019, I'm interested in your viewpoints about what challenges and opportunities the IAIS faces in ensuring those frameworks are appropriate for policyholder protection and contributing to global financial stability. And what lessons have we learned as a standard-setting body for the future work? And Romain, given your role as Deputy Secretary General, this is probably a great one to start with you on.
Thank you very much, David, and I'm very happy to be here. And I would like to thank the NAIC for it has been a fantastic program, and to have this panel on the IAIS activities. I really appreciate that, and that's for us a very good opportunity to present what we do. I think this is a very important question that you made, and we know that standard setting is not like a perfect science. We have to be very humble on that, and there are certainly a long list of challenges. I would like to pick up maybe two of them that I think that are very key in our work. The first thing is that the IAIS is a very inclusive organization. We have more than 200 members, so a vast diversity of situations from developed economies, emerging markets, etc. And so the purpose of standards, particularly the ICPs, they are supposed to be implemented in a wide range of situations. So how can we do that in a meaningful way and making sure that we provide value to all our members? So that's one of the challenges, but I think that's also an opportunity in the sense that our process forces us to get a lot of different perspectives in what we do. And we have this involvement of our members, and so a plurality of perspective to what we do, and we take a lot of time to engaging and testing with our members what we plan to do. So actually we can learn a lot through this process, and we also have a very robust stakeholder engagement. So I think we are very careful to take into account all the perspective to make sure that we have something that is meaningful for the vast community. I mean, the second challenge, and I think this is something that has clearly appeared also in the discussion that we was in the yesterday, is that the world has not stopped moving while we were developing our standards. So how can we ensure that the standards are good not only for past problems, past crises, but also for future risk, emerging risk? So that's also a very important aspect of our work. We try to build those standards so they are robust to these changes, etc. But it's also very important that we regularly reassess. And that's, for instance, what we are currently doing with regard to climate. For climate, we are looking and doing a gap analysis and say, okay, do we have what we need in our supervisory toolkit, in our standards, to help deal with that? So I think that's the key challenges. But again, I would see that as an opportunity because, of course, we want to have standards that are broad enough to cover all the diversity of situations, but also a rapidly changing world.
Excellent. And Bryan, I'd be interested in your take on this question from an industry perspective.
Thanks, Commissioner, and thank you for the forum today. And it's great to be back in person and to see so many old friends that we haven't seen in 2 years. I think just at the outset, I think it's important to note from where we sit at Prudential that standard setting, whether it's done through the IAIS, the NAIC, or other standard setters around the world, are critically important to us as an industry. They promote best practices. Communication, collaboration, cooperation is critical across regulators as well as across the industry. So it's really important. Standards also help to boost confidence in our industry and in our regulatory frameworks. You know, we're in an industry where regulation is part of our value proposition. Strong regulation promotes strong insurance companies and strong markets, and that's what our consumers deserve. Policyholder protection is at the forefront of everything that we do, whether we're in the industry or in the supervisory community. So collaboratively, collectively, it's critically important that we all recognize the importance of standard setting. Obviously, as Romain so aptly pointed out, standard setting is not a perfect science. And that always presents some challenges. Obviously, there's such diversity in insurance markets, probably more so than there is in banking and other financial services. So making sure that standards strike that balance between standardization and accepting, understanding the differences in markets, the differences in consumers in those markets, and the differences in the needs of those consumers and social safety nets across the world is critically important. They must be accommodated through the standards. The standards need to flex, both with transformation in the industry, so the pace of change that's happening, as we've all heard about this week, in the industry, those standards need to flex, need to be able to accommodate for differences in markets. That's not always true, as we know, and ComFrame, or I'm sorry, ICS from where Prudential is one of those issues where we haven't seen that flex to the degree that we'd like to see. I think some of the issues that stand out in ICS for us don't seem to reflect those market differences as much as we think they should. We're hopeful that we can continue to work constructively as we have over the last 5 or 6 or 7, 10, 13 years, however many years you want to put out there, to continue to improve the ICS. We have seen improvements, but there's more that are needed. At the end of the day, as I said, policyholder protection and financial stability are key to our mission. So making sure that we get it right, that we're reflecting those differences is really important. I think on the positive side, or lessons learned, I think we as an IAIG have really taken a lot away from our college interactions. I think ComFrame does a great job in promoting supervisory and industry or company communication. Really, really vital to, again, seeing those emerging risks, seeing how we as a company and the industry is transforming. Colleges are just vital to that in the future, especially for internationally active groups. And then principles-based approaches, I think, also present an opportunity for us in industry and with our regulators. The holistic framework is a really great example of that in terms of how we think about regulation on a more principles-based level going forward. I think about a couple of areas in the future. We'll get to some of this in a little bit, but I think about innovation and technology and how principles-based regulation around those topics are probably better than more prescriptive standards or regulation because it moves so rapidly, change happens so quickly. Regulation, and frankly, in some cases, the industry will not be able to keep pace. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, great, thanks. And So, Siham, I want to kind of chat with you a little bit about, or hear your thoughts anyway, about some of the implementation considerations and expectations across various jurisdictions. So, ComFrame is applicable to internationally active insurance groups, and the holistic framework, of course, is for potentially systemic activities in insurers. So, if a jurisdiction doesn't have an IAIG, wanted to get your thoughts on the relevancy of ComFrame in those situations, and if a jurisdiction doesn't think that it could affect the global insurance market or economy, how does that impact their implementation efforts and the relevancy of the holistic framework?
Thank you, David. First of all, I would like to thank the NAIC for giving me the opportunity to be here today. I'm very happy to share with you my thought regarding this question from my perspective as an emerging market. As you may know, the mission of the IAIS is to promote effective and globally consistent supervision of the insurance industry, of course, in order to develop and maintain fair, stable, and safe insurance markets for the benefit of policy holders and protection, but also to participate and to contribute to the global financial stability. In the context of its mission, the IAIS has issued the common framework called ComFrame for the supervision of internationally active insurance groups, IAIG, which establishes supervisory standards focusing on the effective group-wide supervision of these insurance groups. Typically in Morocco, we do not have any IAIG, but we try to align our supervision with the ComFrame guidelines and to be involved in activities that support this framework. In this sense, we are member of two of IAIG supervisory colleges, and we have joined the crisis management group for one IAIG operating in Morocco. What is important here to know is and to understand that ComFrame do not only applies to the home jurisdiction, but also to host jurisdiction. So in addition, as we are working in Morocco on the development of regulatory framework for group supervision, we rely a lot on the ComFrame guidelines. It's very important for us, and as they help us, of course, to identify how to address activities and risks at the group level and to identify supervisory gaps. With regard to the holistic framework, I would like also to recall that the annual global monitoring exercise, GME, is a key element of this framework. It helps to assess global insurance market trends and developments and to detect, of course, the possible build-up of systemic risk and the global insurance sector. So in Morocco, since 2021, we participate in the GME on a voluntary basis to support the work of the IAIS. So for us, it's very important to have this global and collective supervisory work.
Excellent. Bryan, any thoughts on this one?
Sure. Obviously, it's easy for me to say ComFrame is very relevant to us as an IAIG, but I do think there's some really key concepts within ComFrame that are relevant no matter what type of a company you are or what type of a jurisdiction you're in. I think the whole concept around risk management is critically important. It provides that basis for sound understanding of risk, both from a supervisory and an industry perspective. Critically important, and I think it helps countries and companies kind of get up the curve on risk as they think about it in their current day and as risks emerge over time. So critically important concept in ComFrame that is relevant in any insurance market to any company. Of course, proportionality matters in that context. It's also about the materiality and complexity of the risks, and proportional application of some kind of supervision around risk management is really, really important. I mentioned colleges before. You'll hear this throughout the morning with me. Critically important, I think. And obviously for countries or jurisdictions that don't have an IAIG based in them, participation in other colleges is really important. But I even use the U.S. context in this sort of discussion because, in essence, we have multiple jurisdictions across the United States, 56, right? The conversation between our regulators here in the U.S. really matters, and the collaboration and cooperation just across regulators here in the United States is really important and helps us as industry operate and I think creates a more sound regulatory framework here. So I think another observation is, my last comment on ICS, at least planned comment on ICS, Another observation on the ICS is what's interesting to us is the speed with which some jurisdictions are already moving to the ICS in their local regulatory frameworks. It's happening in Asia. We see it in Taiwan, Korea. Japan is moving in the direction of implementing an ICS-like standard to their domestic framework, so applying it across the industry domestically. It's interesting to us to see that happen so quickly and even before the ICS is finalized. That won't happen in Japan, but critically in Taiwan and Korea, that's what's happened or is happening. So, you know, it's a standard that's not yet finalized at the global level that countries are already moving to, which is of some interest to us and at some point some concern to us.
Excellent. It's hard to have these conversations without mentioning the ICS at least a couple times. So
I'm done.
No worries
until
on
a question comes my way.
Any thoughts on this one, Romain, from the ICS perspective?
Well, I think there was a very. I would like to echo what Siham has said. I think when we think of the IAIS standards, of course we have the expectation, which is basically the ICPs for the supervision of any insurance firm, whatever the market, the complexity, etc. And then we have this layer with ComFrame for the internationally active insurance group, where we have criteria for identifying that, etc. But actually, the reality is like sometimes there's a continuum. So I think first of all, it's important to bear in mind that ComFrame is broader than just the group-wide supervisors of these IAIGs, because it's really about cooperation of supervisors that are involved in the supervision of these cross-border groups that may have operation in great many countries. So the role of the host supervisor, it's absolutely key to the effectiveness of what we have tried to build with ComFrame. So when we think of the 50 groups that have been currently identified of IAIGs, there are like 18, I guess, group-wide supervisor, but actually there's a much higher number of supervisors that are actively contributing to the success of ComFrame by being involved in the colleges. And lastly, I think what is important to flag is that, again, at the end, it's a toolbox. There are many tools, and there are value in these tools that you may want to consider for groups that may become IAIGs that are not currently an IAIG, or for instance, that group that meets the international criteria, but not the size criteria, where you say, okay, there are things that are helpful in ComFrame that I may want to consider. So I think we are happy to provide this diversity of tools, and then it's very up to our members to look at what could be most helpful for their market, for their groups, for their supervision. And I think, so sometimes, okay, you can always go beyond what is the intended application of our standards. And I think it's also true for the holistic framework. Of course, the purpose of the holistic framework was to deal with global systemic risk. But we are also collecting data from our members, and the more members we have, the more relevant is this exercise due to the fact that common exposures can have different type of consequences. So we want to be able to capture that, and whatever has been discussed so far in terms of the new emerging risk, I think it's very important to have this perspective. But also, the way we have done the holistic framework can give ideas about, okay, I want to implement some sort of macro-prudential supervision. We have the ICP24, but the holistic framework provides, I think, a good template to help our members, and also to discuss with the community of supervisors about how they see the risk in their own jurisdiction in the terms that are used by the holistic framework.
Excellent. So I want to stick with the implementation theme for at least another question. So I think over the past years, the IAIS has placed a greater emphasis on its implementation and its assessment activities. And so Bryan, I'll start with you on this one and just get your perspectives on how those efforts are going.
Sure. So I'll kind of go right back to where I started. I think, obviously sound regulation, effective regulation it's a collective value proposition for us. So critically important that implementation of standards works and is effectuated across IAIS jurisdictions. Of course, as I said, proportionality really matters in that context, depending on those scale of risks and the materiality and what the market is or isn't. I think even here in the United States, I think we see significant progress, frankly, in respect to the macro-prudential framework from the IAIS down to where the NAIC is working, and significant advancements here on the macro-prudential initiative and efforts to implement all of those types of standards coming from the IAIS here in the U.S. Critically important, and also applaud the NAIC for their work on their gap analysis on ComFrame. Really important to make sure that the U.S. is completely in line with those standards as they're written, but again, in a more principled way. It's hard for me, I think, from the industry perspective to think about assessment, right? It's not necessarily our tool. However, I think it's important from where we sit in industry to make sure that those assessments are done in an independent and unbiased way, really, really important. Not making specific judgments about specific jurisdictions, really important. That the assessments build into their methodologies an acceptance of flexibility across the standards. Again, to be more market specific, to make sure that the interests and needs of those markets are being met through the standards. And then, of course, proportionality. Those would be the three things that we think about conceptually around an assessment. But again, it's important to have that assessment to make sure that implementation is, again, getting up the curve across the world.
Siham, how about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you, David, for covering this topic. As you may know, implementation and assessment activities are very important of many jurisdictions, especially AMD members who need support in implementing, developing best supervisory practices. In its strategy plan, the IAIS underlined the importance of enhancing and developing assessment activities through different assessment tools, such as the peer review or the member assessment program, the MAP. And here I would like to share with you the experience of Morocco with the MAP. So we participated in this exercise in 2019. And the MAP allows us to assess our level of compliance with the IAIS principles. Most importantly, it has allowed us to feed into our strategic planning and to draw up a specific roadmap for our markets. Thanks to the MAP, we have been able to establish the goals to be achieved in the short and medium terms to be more compliant. So the needs of emerging markets are not the same needs for the developed country, but for us, those tools are really important to be compliant with the ICPs of the IAIS.
Excellent. Romain, you want to wrap this one up for us?
Yes, I just want to say that, of course, implementation is our own measure of success, I would say, and the purpose of our standards is that they are implemented in an efficient way and they do provide results for which they have been developed. So this is a very important area of work, especially because we have moved away from intensive period of standard setting to a more intensive period of implementation and assessment activities. So that's certainly something that is very important for us. We have plenty of ways to do assessment. We are looking at our standards across a great many jurisdictions, peer reviews. We are looking to a jurisdiction and the implementation of all the standards within this jurisdiction. So that's very important. And that's also a component of the feedback loop that we need to do also to be able to assess whether, okay, is there any issue with our standards? But by looking at the way they are implemented, this is very important a component as well. I mean, we've done a lot of work for the assessment, and also particularly in the context of the holistic framework. I think we've done the baseline assessment, and the results were very positive. I mean, we've seen that our members have been very actively engaged in implementing these standards. Of course, they have benefited from the development phase, because it's very open phase, so they could start the implementation. But we see that there's this real movement towards implementation and very good results. So that's certainly something that's going to be confirmed by the targeted jurisdictional assessment, which is a more detailed approach to the assessment. But I think that's certainly a sign that the standards do provide value, and again, that's certainly something that will continue to feed into the IAIS discussion to see, okay, is there something else that we need to do? Because, of course, the standards, they also are in an ecosystem where we have the standard, but all the tools that we develop to help the implementation, like the application paper or this type of things, that they are very also important as a key success factor for implementation.
Excellent. I'm going to keep it with you for this next one. One of the things that we've discussed not only here at the forum, but over the past probably year, if not longer, is the topic of financial inclusion.
Yep.
The IAIS, of course, has its Financial Inclusion Forum as a platform for a lot of these discussions and a lot of opportunity for supervisors to share best practices. But curious to your thoughts, and we'll start again with you, about how the IAIS might, or its members might integrate financial inclusion more broadly into the work that they do.
Thanks, David. That's a very important topic and a clear priority in our work that we have set out in the strategic plan and the roadmap activities as well. As you said, I think we, of course, are very active in the discussion with the Financial Inclusion Forum. But for E, what is key is that it does feed into all our activities. And that's why we have managed direct engagement from the Financial Inclusion Forum with some of our working group, so they can benefit from the discussion and the outcome of the work of the Financial Inclusion Forum and consider what they should be doing in their relevant area of work to help financial inclusion. We are also working very much with our partners. We have A2II, and we have issued on specific topics, I think a lot of guidance or perspective with regard to digitalization and financial inclusion. All the kind of barriers that can exist or things that can help financial inclusion in a very concrete way. And I think that's also probably one of the assets of the IAIS, to be able to also to build on different experience, to think of financial inclusion in very concrete terms and concrete ways of helping in this process.
So inclusive insurance is one of the priorities of the IAIS roadmap, and the Financial Inclusion Forum provides an interesting platform for insurance supervisors to share supervisory practices and to discuss issues, trends, and opportunities on financial inclusion. So in Morocco, we follow with interest the work of this forum, which works and collaborates very closely with the Access to Insurance Initiative. So IAIS member could integrate financial inclusion into its works through the effort of the Access to Insurance Initiative, which is, in my sense, the key implementation partner of the IAIS. So I would like to focus on the work done by the Access to Insurance Initiative because it's very important. I know that Hannah was here yesterday and she shares her thoughts about this issue, but I would like to insist that E2II carry out a large number of activities that are crucial for a large number of EMD jurisdictions to enable them to achieve their supervisory objective and to promote inclusive markets. E2II works with EMD jurisdiction to identify supporting materials to be developed, focusing on certain supervision topics that are specific to EMD markets and which require the development of consistent and important assistance activities. So today, the sustainability of E2II are subject to discussion as and personally as an EMD jurisdiction, I strongly support E2II and advocate for the continuation of its essential work to promote strong, fair and inclusive sector. As a community, I think that we should commit to ensuring that A2II continue to exist. This can only benefit us all.
Excellent. Bryan, any thoughts from you on this one?
Sure, thanks. I think it's a really important topic. I think as, pandemic or not, really, really important, but I think the pandemic really demonstrated where there is inequality in our society. I'd argue this is not a proposition for supervisors alone, for public policymakers alone, NGOs, or industry alone. It has to be solved together. It needs to be ideated on together. It's vital in all insurance markets, emerging or even developed markets. Even here in the United States, you see the social inequality that exists and the need for more financial inclusion and inclusive insurance across the socioeconomic spectrum. So critically important. And I think we collectively can all learn from each other in this context. I would point out the Geneva Association has done some really terrific research on these topics in the last 2 or 3 years. In 2020, they published a report on the role of insurance in mitigating social inequality. I highly recommend that the audience and more broadly, folks take a look at that research. There's also a great report from 2021 on the emerging or future risk landscape post-COVID. I'm not sure, hopefully we are post-COVID at some point in our lifetimes. And there's soon a report coming out on emerging market policy and regulation that talks to some of those key financial inclusion issues. There will be a whole series of work coming out from the Geneva Association in the next 2 years that focus on inclusive insurance topics that I think will help inform the dialogue going forward. I think though as insurers, where we can help, where we need to help, is to see the needs through the eyes of those who have the needs and not necessarily from our perch as insurance companies. Put ourselves more in the shoes of those that have the needs, that are undercovered or not covered. Really important to help then design the products that are necessary for society going forward so that it is more inclusive. Design solutions that are simplified, that meet those needs, really, really important. The pace of change around innovation. Innovation's critical to access. Romain, you mentioned that. It's really, really important. Digital innovation will lead to more inclusion. It's making sure that we are collectively in that discussion together to make sure that it's principles-based in terms of regulation and policy around how we are able to access our customers through digital means, and they're able to access us. And I think, just bottom line, it's all about partnership. Partner. We won't solve this alone. We need to solve it together.
Well, as you've all said, it's one of the most, if not the most important issue that we're faced with, and I think you're spot on with respect to how important partnerships are going to be as we move forward addressing that issue. And appreciate your comment about the emergence of technology as something that's going to be critically important on that front as well. And I kind of want to pivot a little bit off of that. While financial inclusion is one of our more important emerging issues, it's not the only important emerging issue. We've had conversations across the forum about a variety of different things, including the emergence of technology and innovation and big data and a host of other things. And so wanted to get your thoughts. Romain, we'll start with you. But how is the IAIS as an organization, how are they doing and what are they doing to stay abreast of these emerging issues and be responsive to the challenges that arise along with them?
That's a very important question. That's something that we discuss a lot in building our strategic plan. I think that the IAIS has done a good job in embedding this question in its own governance, but making sure that we can provide an adequate response to this risk. And I think the way we are approaching that is by making sure that we have the right tools and governance in place to address that. And I think I would like to give you a bit of examples on that. First of all, I think it's very important that we come with some a holistic view of these topics. They are very complex, they are multidimensional, so it's very important to have that. And that's why, for instance, we have these high-level strategic groups where our members come and discuss and what should be the adequate strategy, what should be the role of the IAIS, what should be the priorities for the IAIS in addressing this new emerging risk. So for instance, we have this climate risk strategic group that has been set up, that's delivered very quickly a clear strategy about what should be the position, the work of the IAIS on that. Another important aspect is that, of course, we are never alone to work on that, and that's very important that we are, of course, very open to our members because they do contribute to this, and we build on their experience. But of course, there are a lot of other institutions that are active in that. We mentioned the Financial Inclusion Forum, we are an active member of that. So it's also important that we associate them into our work, and that's why we have this forum, which are a little bit open to a broader range of than only our members. So that's, we mentioned the Financial Inclusion Forum, we have the FinTech Forum. And also I think we need to have responsibility and leadership. And that's also why we have decided to have champions. So they are senior people, member of the executive committee that can basically, push forward this work. And you've heard earlier today, Petra, our FinTech champion. And I think that's also very important because this is rapidly moving. You need to be sure that you can adjust all the time to the changes. And so you need to have someone that can push these topics. And the last element, which I think is also very important, is what we do in terms of collecting data, getting some information to help us assessing the risk and making the good decision in terms of the next step. So we now have this platform with the GME, the Global Monitoring Exercise. This is one way for us to collect at the global level information. We have the GMAR special topic that helps us for more exploratory work of how we could do that on a more regular way. And of course, all the dialogue that we have established with the stakeholders, which are very important. We have many opportunities to discuss with the industry in a very open way, and I think that's also an important element to make sure that at every point in time, we are able to prioritize what needs to be delivered to be meaningful to our members.
And Bryan, I'll get your perspectives in a slightly different vein, but are there priorities that you feel the IAIS should be focusing on, especially in light of existing commitments versus resources?
I think it is a priority. I think it should be at the top of the list. I think it's about innovation around technology and product, and then that flows to data too. I think critically important, obviously to the financial inclusion conversation, but it's important to transformation across the industry also, just broadly. So it needs to have attention paid to it by all corners, and is really important as we continue to progress in the industry. I think there are some really great lessons that were learned through the pandemic, especially through the lockdowns, and the relative fast pivot to allowing for digital interaction with customers. Less markets actually could have frozen, meaning our market, meaning being able to touch customers in the way that we had to from a regulatory or just customer-focused way, needed to happen through technology. We couldn't be face-to-face. We couldn't do things in person. That pivot is critically important to the future also. So, there was a lot of temporary relief provided across the world to the industry. I think regulators really need to take a hard look at that temporary pivot and the temporary relief and think about how you integrate that into a more permanent standard or regulatory regime. Really, really important, because that will facilitate financial inclusion. It will facilitate access. I think we all had trepidations at the beginning of the pandemic about whether or not customers would want to interact with us technologically through digital means. And we have found in the last 2 years that now that's becoming more of a preference than not. So it's how do we seize off of that progress made, making sure that we're making things more permanent, more stable over time to promote that access, to promote financial inclusion. That's, for us, that's right at the top of the list.
So I want to kind of stick with the theme of regulatory and supervisory priorities. We are getting some questions from the audience, and one of them kind of fits in with the discussion we're currently having, so I'm going to interject it now. And I'm assuming based on the 4 likes, we've got some interest in this question, but would be interested in your thoughts, and we can start with Siham, and you're all welcome to jump in here. How in sync do you all think the priorities are between supervisors and industry and the IAIS, where the IAIS puts most of its resources? How in sync do you think that is? Do you think there's a mismatch potentially? And Siham, we'll start with your thoughts on this one.
So I believe that the collaborative approach is the winning strategy. In addition, an agile approach is needed to be able to understand and deal with all emerging risks. I think that the IAIS has been responsive in the last years, especially during the COVID-19 crisis. It has been able to manage the different risks in the best possible way. It has also developed the tools to identify trends and detect risks with a focus on emerging risks. I would like to refer to the GMAR, the Global Insurance Market Report. In 2021, the 3 macro-prudential themes were identified as supervisory priorities. First, low yield environment and private equity ownership. The second one is the credit risk, and the third one, the cyber risk. I think that we had a lot of discussion yesterday on the panels on this issue, but the 2021 edition has also covered the special topic to the impact of climate change, so on the financial stability of the insurance sector. So the special edition topic provides the first quantitative global study and the impact of climate change on the insurance sector. And just before us, the panel that we had spoke about this issue regarding the climate change. But in conclusion, I would like to insist that the fact that the IAIS is all about collective action. So let's work together maybe to ensure that supervision and risk management are as effective as possible.
Excellent, thank you. And Bryan, you might have some good insights onto this one. As you think about industry priorities and where the IAIS puts its resources, how do you feel about the matchup there?
I think looking forward, I think the IAIS is really beginning to focus on, in a sense, the right things, if you will, whatever right or wrong is in this context. But I think that's really important. I think we all have to be looking ahead. You've heard yesterday and today, the pace of change is significant in the industry and in the regulatory community. And making sure that we're keeping up with that together is really important, because things will emerge that we need to be engaged in together. And if things are missed, or if there isn't that communication, that level of collaboration, that's where troubles arise, I think. And one could argue about the focus on ICS or not. I think you all know my view on that. So I think we collectively at Prudential believe that going forward, it's about making sure we're sort of looking out over the horizon just a touch together to see where those emerging risks will be. And there have been several forums that the IAIS has held with chief risk officers or other SMEs within companies and within the industry. And I think more of that needs to be done. I think that will help the dialogue within the IAIS as a closed regulatory community, in a sense, to keep an eye out for things that may emerge. That's for us. I mean, obviously, innovation is for us the priority in terms of the way that supervisors think about it. But even looking out a little bit over the horizon, I think that greater collaboration is needed, greater interaction is needed on some of those other issues.
Yeah. I had a feeling we could get you to mention the ICS again.
All right, well, that was unplanned.
So Romain, you're there at the Secretariat with the IAIS. How do you feel about the synchronization between where you all put your resources and the priorities of supervisors in industry?
Well, I will have a very pragmatic perspective on that. I think, of course, this is certainly something that we actively monitor, and I think now we have put in place the tools, better tools to do that. In our data collection, we ask not only our members, but also the groups to provide their view about what are the key risks going forward, and they provide an assessment on that. And we are looking at that, and that's feed into the collective discussion that our executive committee has in September. And so in the way to assess our priorities, we benefit from this input. And to be very honest, when I've listened to all the discussion that has happened today, yesterday at this forum, I think there's a great alignment when we think about the priorities. There could be different views about the how to deal with them. I mean, of course, as insurance supervisor, we need to build the foundations for a good response to these emerging themes, etc. And sometimes you could say, okay, this is a lot of resources to put that in place. But this is to make sure that we have a platform that can be used to deal with this risk. I mean, I think one of the good examples is that when we have built the holistic framework, there was some skepticism sometimes, was that a little bit too much for the purpose of this global monitoring exercise, not too costly in terms of data, etc. And we have seen with the COVID-19 how we were able to repurpose this exercise to have some meaningful discussion about how to coordinate the response, supervisory response to this unprecedented crisis. So I think that's very important. And I think we always try to test what we think our priorities. We have a very open process to get feedback from stakeholders. So that's something that I think we are trying to do a good job, but of course there could be different views. And the last element, it's for sure, is that we also need to provide value to all our members. And sometimes priorities from some jurisdiction cannot be the same priorities for others because of the nature of their market, because of the nature of this exposure. But we have to make sure that the IAIS is able to provide value to all its membership.
David, if I could just one comment.
Yeah.
So I agree, data collection is very, very important in the context of the GMAR exercise and the report. Context around data matters just as much.
Yeah.
I think that's critically important as you move forward and think about it through the IAIS lens about how you're engaging stakeholders, especially companies that are directly impacted by findings, just broadly the industry, but companies that are directly impacted or identified through the GMAR process. Mm-hmm. Really important that the context around data is explained, discussed, and considered.
If I may just say that, I think
Sure.
I would fully agree with that. And I think it's very important. Of course, we speak a lot about the data collection, but I think it's very important that everyone has in mind that this process is not only about collecting some kind of raw data, because we also collect qualitative information, qualitative assessment. And then when we get the data, we never stop at the data level, right? We always get back with a feedback loop where we try to understand what is beyond the data, etc. So that's always for us, and I think that's the case for supervisor in their job, is only the starting point of the discussion, not the end point. We don't pretend that we will resolve everything just by doing like very nice curves or tables, etc. But it's very important that the starting point is the data. And I think we also probably help in the sense that what we try to build at the global level can also be helpful in getting more harmonization in type of the information that can be collected by our members, and also by building a global view of the sector, also in discussing from a cross-sectoral approach, contributing to the FSB, contributing to the policy discussion beyond the insurance sector. It's very important that the sector is able to provide its own view in a very robust way.
Great discussion. I want to go to another audience question because I think it dovetails nicely with the conversation we're having now. We're talking about emerging issues and the role of the IAIS in addressing those going forward. One of the things I think that's been really interesting about the emerging issues that have come about in the past couple of years is that they're not insurance specific. They're across the broader financial spectrum, and even across the broader societal spectrum outside the financial realm. So I'm interested, and we'll start with you, Romain. With respect to the IAIS and its members and the industry, how are we coordinating with other bodies that might be looking at this same issue, such as the FSB and the OECD and others that might be out there?
That's certainly a very important aspect. I mean, we are very involved in the FSB work, for instance. I mean, a large part of the FSB work is to assess vulnerabilities and look at this emerging risk. And of course, what we don't want is for them to duplicate our work, and we want also to be able to bring the insurance perspective. It's quite interesting in a sense that when we bring the insurance perspective, it's not only about the risk of the sector, right, and exposure of the sector, but how this sector can contribute to the resilience of the financial sector, right? Because it's an important tool to provide resilience to other parts of the financial sector. So of course, we are very much involved in the discussion with the FSB. For instance, I am a member of the FSB group on assessing vulnerabilities. Our chair is a member of the key standing committees of the FSB. So we are very active in that. And I think it's very important because a lot of this work, and there's a lot of international institutions that are involved in that. So we definitely want to avoid duplication of work because there's too many things to do and we want to avoid that. But we also want to make sure that the specificities of our sector is recognized. And that's why, I mean, the IAIS can play this role, but to allow the IAIS to play this role, it has to be able to provide a consistent global view, including a quantitative one, to feed into this discussion.
Siham or Bryan, either one of you have thoughts on this question?
Insurance is different than banking, so thank you, Romain.
Yes.
I agree with you.
Maybe we can vote.
Maybe a little bit of a focus on the OECD. I've had the benefit of being able to work directly with the OECD for a number of years, and sometimes I get a little concerned about what seems to be a relative disconnect between what the IPPC, the Insurance and Private Pensions Committee of OECD, is working on and some of the agenda topics at the IAIS. And what's interesting is many of OECD member insurance regulators are also definitely members of the IAIS. So sometimes it seems like there's a disconnect between the agendas. They don't need to be exactly matched, but I think greater collaboration across OECD and IAIS would be beneficial, especially to the degree that OECD research and work is helping to inform the way the IAIS thinks about issues as they emerge.
Maybe just to flag, it's important to bear in mind that the perspective that the IAIS is taking to these topics is the perspective of insurance supervisors, right? We are a technical body, if I may say so. So I can appreciate sometimes there could be different views, for instance, at the OECD. I think the role of the IAIS is to bring the supervisory perspective to this, and there could be other perspective to that. But I think it's very important for us to be able to, we are unique in the sense that we are this global organization and provide this perspective, and I think that's what should be our role in the debate. So there could be different of view, because I could assume that from a non-supervisor it could be a different perspective to that, but I think that our role is really to bring this supervisory perspective.
Excellent. Any thoughts or?
Nothing special, maybe just about globalization, because insurance markets are more and more globally interconnected. So this will require an effective and globally consistent approach to supervision of global insurance group, and also the cooperation is the key of giving answers to the emerging risks. So that's just what I would like to add in this regard.
Sure. We're going to keep it with you for the next question. And this is one that I'm always fascinated to hear perspectives about. So we've talked a lot about the emerging issues that we're thinking about today. And one thought I always have in the back of my head is, what are the things that might emerge tomorrow that I'm not thinking about today? I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen over the past little while is just how quickly these issues can emerge and be extraordinarily relevant to our markets and to our consumers. And while the risks that can emerge seem to be limitless, what we've discovered is that what's not limitless is the resources that IAIS has and supervisory bodies have to devote to those. So talking about, you mentioned partnerships at the outset of our discussion, and we've talked about collaboration. Collectively, what can we do as a sector to identify, coordinate, and address emerging issues as they come up in the future?
So, sorry, I think that innovation and inclusive insurance, it's one of the key, and here Bryan spoke about that. By supporting innovative and inclusive insurance, market will be able to participate in closing the protection gap and promotion of more resilient financial systems. So the second maybe trends will be the emerging risk. We talk about a lot about the emerging risk, and number of emerging risk are impacting insurance. But to help maybe supervisors to handle this risk, in particular the EMD market, it is necessary to focus on implementation and supporting good supervisory practices. So we all discussed about this since the beginning of this panel. For that, supervisor maybe are invited to promote activities that facilitate peer exchange and targeted capacity building. It's very important, and I will finish with that, because for me, cooperation are really the key for the supervisors to find solutions to emerging risks.
David, I think, in addition to all the things that we've discussed today, I think thinking about the macroeconomic environment, I know, which was discussed yesterday, and are we at a point now where we're at the end of globalization? I mean, even thinking about that really, really big question and how that applies geopolitically and at the macroeconomic level is something I think that we all need to consider collectively. Obviously, macroeconomic forces are having significant impact on just the global economy. And I think how we think about that as an industry, as supervisors, as policymakers, will really matter. I think, again, are we at the end of globalization? Given all the supply chain issues, given sort of what the geopolitics are right now, there's been a lot written in the last month and a half, 2 months about the end of globalization. So I think, as a global organization, the IAIS needs to think about that. And then what does that mean for the insurance sector? I'd argue that as a life insurance company that is global, it's a global footprint, but we're not global in the context necessarily of our insurance. We are bricks and mortar in many countries. We have distinct entities in those countries, and we write insurance in those markets because those are the needs of the society that we're in. So it's a global company. It's not necessarily a global model in terms of the way that we provide insurance, because it can't be. So I think what the impacts of the macroeconomic environment and perhaps the end of globalization as we have known it in the last 30, 40, 50 years is something that I think the IAIS should think about.
Well, it's not an easy question, of course. I think maybe and with a lot of humility, I would say probably two things. First of all is that at the end of the day, I think that the role of this sector is to manage risk, right? So, and that's with the S, right? And so I think probably we want to avoid to look at each and every risk separately. I think we need to build the good foundation for us to collectively, insurers and insurance supervisors, to be able to deal to whatever new risk could emerge. So I would think of making sure that we have the toolbox, we have the foundations, we have the platform to address whatever could come next. And I will give you just one example. When we were to develop the application paper on ICP24, which is about the one about macro-prudential supervision, and we had a bit of a question, what should be the perspective to that to add in the ICP24? And we say, okay, we're not going to look at by risk and say, okay, this is what we should be doing for this risk, this is what you should be doing for this macro-prudential risk. We say, okay, why don't we give examples? Why don't we give a toolkit, right? To say, okay, this is the wide range of tools that you can use to deal with whatever could come next, right? And I think this is probably something that we should be working on. And it's very important also that the insurers build themselves their own toolkit to address the different risks. Now, if we think of what could be coming next, I think you mentioned digitalization. I think that is absolutely key. This is going to be a game changer. So I think we need to be very much aware of that. There could be plenty of scenarios as a consequence of digitalization. But it's very, very at the heart of a lot of the transformation. So that's certainly something that is, for me, we need to be able to appreciate that and deal with that. I mean, I think that another important change or transformation that's going to, is to mention the macro-prudential environment. The world is going to change, that's for sure. But more than that, I would say in a sense, is that even if maybe there's less of a globalization of insurance market, we see a clear globalization of risk. All these emerging risks are really global in nature. When I want to think of something that could trigger a major systemic event for the insurance sector, for instance, I could speak of cyber, right? Cyber. Why do we think that cyber should stop at the frontier of a jurisdiction? Why a pandemic would stop at the frontier of a jurisdiction? So whenever we discuss all these risks, we see that they are absolutely global. So I think what is very important also, and is to be able to build the conditions of a good supervisory cooperation in order to deal with that. Because when it will happen, this coordination will be absolutely key to have an effective response.
Excellent, thank you. So we do have a lot of audience questions here, and I want to try to get through some of them. The first one is the most liked one. I'm nervous that we might not have the expertise on the panel to address it. It's pretty specific, but I'll ask it just in case. So it says European insurers can qualify as surplus lines providers in the US, but there's no reciprocity in Europe for American insurers, and is that being addressed? I will admit that I'm not sure if it is or not. Anybody know if that's being addressed or not? All right, we'll email that off to our colleagues and see if we can get an answer for that one. Romain, you've got a very specific question for you, and that is, how can the IAIS better help members follow through after assessments to address compliance with standards that might be deficient?
I don't know if I would say better help, because that's certainly what we try to do anyway. I think this feedback loop is absolutely important. So we know based on the outcome of the assessment, and we have this process of looking at application papers. So that should identify what has been, for instance, barriers to implementation of our standards or challenges in the implementation, and so provide some concrete examples or guidance in how to overcome them. So I think we are working really in two ways. One way is by bilateral discussions with our members. So it's never like only the assessment like in school and that you get to. It's about, okay, why don't we discuss now about the outcome of the assessment and try to understand why there's been this result. So this dialogue with members is absolutely key. And assessment is done by other members in a sense. So they are also coming from their own experience and they can share their perspective on that. And then I think we need to take stock of the outcome of all these assessments. And if there's a difficulty, then we need to address that for all the members. And that come in the second stage. So we are very much still in doing the assessment, so that's probably going to come next, but that's certainly something that really matters for us.
Okay, excellent. And I don't mean to leave anybody else out. That question was directed specifically to Romain, but if either of you have thoughts on that, feel free to weigh in. So I think, Bryan, I'm going to go to you. You've got also a question directed specifically to you, and it's whether or not you would be interested in discussing recent community development initiatives and whether any similar activity is happening internationally.
Is it specific to Prudential? I guess that's the question. I want to know.
Maybe answer from an industry standpoint, and then if you have any Prudential specific responses, feel free to provide those as well.
Sure. So there are various initiatives, I think, as a result of some of the racial equity issues that came up 2 years ago around George Floyd, that the industry has gotten very engaged in racial equity considerations since, but was involved well before the situation 2 years ago. So I think there's a rededication from the U.S. industry to our communities. I think you see a lot of insurance companies in the United States with significant impact investing portfolios that are really driving at trying to build social equity, economic equity across the spectrum here in the United States. So Prudential's done a lot of great things in this space. We're based in Newark, New Jersey. We've been there for since our founding. We're almost 150 years old. We are very committed to the community in Newark. We are on the path to leading to the city's revitalization. And equally, other insurers here in the United States are committed to their communities that they're based in, but even more broadly across the spectrum here in the United States. And I'm aware, just from a Prudential point of view, of similar things that we do in Brazil, where we have multiple operations. So critically important that we are engaged. The community that we're in, the community that we serve, is vital to us, and we are, as a socially conscious company, need to be involved and want to be involved.
Excellent. Well, we're clearly getting close to the end of our time because we have some shenanigans coming in the questions. So I'm just going to read this to humor everyone. Is the current budget committee chair the best one the IAIS has ever had? Well, I think the PCC is meeting soon, so we'll discover if that's true or not.
That's what the chuckle was for, actually.
Yeah. So we have just a few minutes left, and Siham, I think you had.
So I'm just interested by the question regarding the political pressure. So I'm not going to maybe answer on behalf of the IAIS, but I think that the IAIS is an association for the whole jurisdictions all over the world. It could be in emerging markets or developed market, but I think that the work done within the Secretariat of the IAIS doesn't matter of any political pressure, and Romain is here maybe to confirm that. It is important to know because since the last years, personally, I'm involved within the IAIS since 2013, and I can tell you that the work it's really interesting, and the work done also with the emerging markets are really interesting. Today, for the emerging markets, we have the third vice chair, which is somebody from the emerging markets, and the idea is to address also the needs of the emerging markets. We talked about the need of emerging markets and also with the assessment, and today we have a forum for the solvency-based risk. This is a need for the emerging markets. I can understand that today the discussion is about ICS in developed country, but maybe in other jurisdiction they are just at the step of the solvency-based risk.
Excellent. That was an interesting question, and about specific political pressures the IAIS takes into account by jurisdiction. So thanks for pulling that one out and weighing in on that one. So rapidly changing world, rapidly changing insurance landscape, rapidly changing regulatory landscape. The IAIS and its members and the industry and all of our stakeholders are going to play a really critical role in addressing those issues as we move forward. So appreciate your perspectives on these. Any final thoughts on that theme before we turn it back to Commissioner Anderson, who's one of the best G committee chairs the NAIC has ever had, if we're going to stick with the theme there. And we've had a lot of good ones. Any final thoughts?
That was my final thought.
That was there you go.
David, I'll end with the ICS because I see the question about the back testing. I can't talk to what the supervisors at the IAIS do about back testing on capital standards and what that means for the future consumer needs, et cetera. But as we think about the relative shortness of the monitoring period, meaning how much time we have left, I think that question is critical as the IAIS thinks about impact analysis and impact assessment. Right? It's that impact assessment that will be done on the ICS needs to be that back test. So if it hasn't already happened, it's critical that the back testing understanding what those capital requirements mean for the offering of products, critically important for markets that IAIGs are based in, but also critically important ultimately over time to emerging markets that may not be adopting ICS out of the gate, but that backtesting matters a lot, and it matters to consumers in insurance, that are insurance customers.
Excellent. Final thoughts from any final thoughts?
Actually, nothing to add, but just to be aware that cooperation is really important. So I'm here maybe to represent the emerging markets, and I was very happy to be here. For me, one of the most important things is to learn from other jurisdictions, developed country, how things are going there, and maybe to try to figure it out in our countries. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about that, and that was it. Thank
Excellent. Well, you all came a very long way to share some very valuable perspectives, and I'm thrilled to have had a front row seat to it. And I know our audience has also come a very long way. We appreciate your questions, and we appreciate you hearing us out. Would you join me in thanking our panelists for their thoughts today? Thank you. And we will turn it back over to Commissioner Anderson.